Hello, my name is Tolk, and I exist, therefore I think too much. So, I was watching a video, and this gentleman I was watching was talking about how it's become fashionable, or it had been, plus it is fashionable, to act poor. And I guess I have multiple things to say about it, but I'm not entirely sure, and I didn't write it out beforehand or bullet point it beforehand. So it'll be put together very sloppily. The US economically exists having 1 foot in legality and 1 foot in illegality as a governing body. And if that weren't the case, the CIA would not have published documents proclaiming that they have used their own citizens, the US citizens, as a testing ground for certain chemicals, and they would not have also released documents pertaining to which chemicals they pushed into society, especially which type of society, or which society. All of this to say, illegality is a part of what economy depends on. It does circulate money. As much as, any upright citizen that believes they are morally superior to anybody else would like to claim it doesn't. Oops, I did my headphones again. It totally does. And that creates something, I think it's the album by Outkast called Aquemini. I don't remember the song. I think it's just You Scared or something. But the song describes how it was pushed onto a community, this specific chemical that they're talking about, and then it finds its way into the white community, at which point the white community starts actually being afraid, where it had already existed prior to their children finding it. And in my own existence, I found that that pain granted you a card other people did not have. Being a survivor granted you a strength other people were not provided just by existing alone. And I mentioned in another video how Omaha is segregated where I'm from. So again, purely my experience, what I often found was that in order to claim recognition by anybody, or to be perceived as someone having something worth other people having, you participated in drug culture, whether you were the seller or the buyer. Sellers, pushers, not dealers, can be divided into people who went into it because they were struggling and it was a viable option to make money easily and quickly and elevate them to a position they felt they deserved. And some pushers got into it for purely exaltation of ego. So more often than not, with the pushers that got into it purely to have the egoic rush they wanted, it was because they came from a frame of life that, I guess personally, intrinsically, they felt they had not struggled enough and needed that struggle to justify their existence. And then in buyers, you have people that fell into the addiction. You have people that other people wanted to use, so pushed the addiction onto them. You have people that wanted to be scrubbed clean of their parents' gains. Because being born rich, being born wealthy, being born well off, puts you in one of two positions. You either claim being well off and understand it's your parents' money, and have to work to gain that level of recognition both from your parents and from society, Or you turn to community, to society, a different type of society, and you choose to say, no, I'm not like them. And in modern day, eat the rich became a very prevalent thing. And even throughout history, there has been a great divide between working class and wealthy. And I feel like, without having direct experience in historical events, it could very well possibly be the same thing, that you are not seen as someone worth respecting if what you have was quote-unquote given to you. The rest of society will see you having been platformed, being at least provided the ability to network more than they did, as a leg up on them, and therein they will not want to respect you. So in modern day, it has definitely been pushed that your hard work, at least in the US, your hard work, your hard effort is well worth more than being born with it. Maybe that's why plastic surgery is on the rise. And so when you get back into drug culture, and forgive me, but, in anthropology and sociological studies, I'm pretty sure that poverty is just shoulder to shoulder with drug culture. And so I don't necessarily mean that when you find poverty, you will absolutely be tied in to drug culture, but I'll try to connect it after I get done ranting in this specific direction. So with the children of the wealthy scrubbing themselves of their parents' endeavors, you'll find them feeling like they are more connected to others by pursuing drugs. So that creates a dichotomy where the individual selling wants the money, so they don't mind being used as not even, the term token black person, not even token black, but token street. This is my friend, and through them I have reputation. Through their deeds, I am granted my ground with others. You can do that in poor cultures. It is a lot harder to do that in wealthier cultures. Name dropping can only get you so far the higher the ladder you climb. You will, if you use it, the more you climb the ladder, you will forever be seen as someone not worth knowing because you are a parasite. But the lower the class, name dropping gets you in certain doors that you would not have been able to get into otherwise. Still have not figured out why that's the case. I just understand it to be the case. I think it's based on community versus society. You have to have more of a community in poverty than a society. And modern day kind of blurs that line a bit, but I'm pretty sure that was initially the premise. So, in at least since the 60s, I don't know if it's been since before that, but no, you had a lot of what is seen as cool, even onto the 1910s, 1920s, being provided through culture that was found because people needed brevity from struggle. So, personally, I am a huge fan of the Zoot Suit, and it's just, an entire community of people that were like, we don't want to support the war. Fuck the war. We're not doing fabric rations. We're going to use too much fabric and make a statement against the government. So you have it in fashion. You have it in, I was going to say dress code, but that's fashion. You have it in music and I believe food as well. And so even if you aren't participating in drug culture, it has largely been understood that where there is struggle, there are drugs. And anybody not participating in either poverty or drugs has a tendency to not understand where the fashion trends are coming from. And with this push of technology in our current generation, specifically more so Gen Z, but maybe also younger millennials, you had a lot of people utilizing drug terminology, referencing drugs, to feel like they fit in. There was I'm going to put the microphone down, but there was that move. That move where it's essentially, shooting up heroin. And I don't think enough people respected where the fuck they were getting it from, what they were doing. And I think as a society, we've been taught to repeat what is fashionable without thinking about it. And so therein, you have the wealthy not wanting to be eaten, not wanting to be taken down for not having earned their place. And you have everybody else wanting to fit in with those of whom need to push past to provide brevity. So push harder into creativity than others. And so this group of everybody else, quote unquote name drops, does the same movement to say, no, I'm with it. I fit in. This is where I belong. Don't look down on me because I don't have the same experiences you do. So I feel like that propped up, this ideation that a status of victimhood, whether that be having been victimized by the governing bodies, having been victimized by social abuses, having been victimized by personal, intimate relationship abuses, whatever it is, it built into the ideation that was well worth your person. And that is fed into by the U.S. society being at large psychopathic. When I laid this out yesterday when I was talking to my significant other, and I've said it enough times in enough emotionally stimulated rants, so it's going to be a long one. But the U.S. specifically has a incredibly entwined relationship with drug usage. And I mean, if you look at drug usage throughout the world historically, everybody does. Hello, Maui. With opium being pushed as a tool of war. So, if you wanted your opponent to fail at recruiting soldiers, you would push opium onto the lower parts of society, like prostitution. And then everybody that goes through prostitution would slowly be addicted to opium. It would dwindle into each part of society. So that was, I'd say maybe 500 AD, something like that. I can't necessarily put a time on it, but it was pretty ancient culture tactic to do that. And then you had Europe, I don't know how close to that time, but after that, being besotted with opiates and tonics that were opium-based, which found its way into the U.S., with colonizing having taken place. White culture promoted its drug use over into the U.S., and so there was an increase in opium and opiates. There was also an increase in alcoholism, like 100-fold. And so the, creation of the U.S. through the 13 colonies, and I don't mean to reference any indigenous culture prior to it, because I can only study up on so many of them, so I don't have a good understanding of anything related to that and I only mean to speak when I say the creation of U.S. to the 13 colonies pushing their way across the land. So, referencing that, the U.S. was initially founded with a heavy usage of alcoholism. And then you had the 13 colonies were overwhelmed with illnesses because the germs found in the New World, quote unquote, compared to whichever country had sent them over, the immune system was not built up to fight it. As well as the diet was different, so they didn't know how to cope with everything that was happening. A lot of people died off. And so with these initial colonies, you had a lot of people running them saying, sending letters back to whichever the starting country was, saying, we need more people to be able to found these colonies. Can you please keep sending people? Which turned these colonies into prison colonies. And the countries continued to send people, but whom they were sending was the rejects of their society. So, they had a lot of prostitutes sent over, and during the time they were suffering a good amount of sexually transmitted diseases, syphilis being, incredibly high numbers for people, which, effects of certain STDs can be handed down generationally as well. Chemical effects of it. And you also had the criminally insane, which, again, would have been handed down generationally. You had anybody of a wealthy standing being punished with being sent to the 13 colonies. It was essentially seen as exiles. So any mental illness from anybody that was exiled from these countries would have been inherited from these 13 colonies. Then you move on from those, and the expansion, like I said, I'm not sure when it would have been introduced. I've not been able to find that, but I do know that in early 1900s, onto today, cocaine use was incredibly prominent in the U.S. So early 1900s, you had up to 1950, cocaine was legal. And then if you combine a heavy stimulant with a suppressant, so cocaine with alcohol, alcoholism still being rampant, people also still utilizing opium tonics, which in and of itself is another severe depressant. You get emotional unintelligence. It dysregulates your emotions because you no longer have the ability to produce the serotonin and dopamine that a normal healthy person would produce. And these chemicals are handed down generationally. So now you're taking into consideration with considering the 1900s, late 1800s, 1900s, the wars that the U.S. participated in and went through. I can't speak for the drugs that were utilized during the Civil War. I would assume, heavy amounts of alcohol. But what I can speak on is the World Wars. You had cigarettes pushed pretty fucking heavy to all of the soldiers. Alcoholism, again, wildly rampant. So now you've got nicotine replacing certain neurotransmitters in the brain. Happiness being reliant on that, being sated being reliant on that, and social understanding, awareness, or capacity to understand information being reliant on nicotine. Then you have the suppressant taking away a dependence on, you stop producing enough dopamine. And after a while of not producing a certain chemical, your system is told, okay, it doesn't need to produce that, so I'll stop producing it. Then, Second World War, the Nazis create methamphetamine as a way of keeping their soldiers fighting, so they fight past their death, because they don't feel the shock. Methamphetamine is carried over into the States around that time. It won't become as prevalent until 1980s. Then you have, in the 1950s, an experiment done on some village in France concerning a very specific type of mold. It would eventually become LSD, and it would be pushed into the public in the US 1960s and 1970s. And while cocaine became an illegal substance after the 50s, that does not mean that it was not still utilized. Then you have how the Second World War affected people emotionally. You have a lot of trauma. So the silent generation would come back and have an ego built up around their having fought people, watching people die in front of them, having killed people. They've become a survivor, and that is who they are. That is how they know themselves. So they're raising the boomers. Then you have their wives who were forced into out of, taking care of the household, taking care of bookkeeping, and being forced into working wives to support the war. You have everybody else who is working class in poverty, suffering the trauma that is the Dust Bowl at the same time as that. So you're seeing a lot of deaths within the US as well, due to large starvation. And then an added factor to all of this is when you see an economic decline, you see simultaneously a rise in social conservatism. So an increase in religious idealism, and then you also simultaneously, correlation, causation, not sure, see an uptick in child trafficking. So that is the silent generation, the beginning of the boomers. And then the boomers are raised by the silent generation, essentially telling them that they ought to earn their ego because they'll never be worth as much as the silent generation was, and that they'll never have to go through what the silent generation did. So the boomers are taken care of by very emotionally neglectful peoples, as well housewives returning to the homes had heavy pharmaceuticals pushed on them. So the beginnings of suppressant medication and SSRIs like Xanax, maybe not by that same name, were pushed onto housewives to keep them motivated, I guess. I'm not sure the reason, but that also happened. So boomers inherited a dependence on, not necessarily like an attraction to, but a chemical dependence on lacking serotonin and dopamine from the chemical abuses of the prior generation, as well as the traumas of the prior generation. So this may not have even been understood by them, but I think animalistically people are drawn to try to balance that out and seek out other things that make them feel good, even if they don't understand why. And so you see, again, in the boomers, an uptick in weed usage, as well as alcoholism, a little less reliance on cocaine. And then you have the Vietnam War also, with cigarettes, alcohol, and weed, so heavy suppressants. And I mentioned prior, you have the 60s and the 70s with the government pushing LSD onto the US. And LSD is a heavy hallucinogen, but the other chemicals of it I've not been able to study. I would argue that it's heavier on the hallucinogen and a mild suppressant, but it does have the ability to rewire your neural network system. meaning your receptor that is made to receive dopamine can be rewired instead to want to receive a different chemical. And I think that it is folly to believe that you have the ability to control that, the rewiring, which a lot of people, there was this concept of microdosing to help yourself, believe that they have the ability to control the rewiring. What you can do is try to influence it with, like, while microdosing, doing healthy things. But at the end of the day, you're not physically in your brain. You can't sit there and, like, tell the network that it needs to do exactly what you believe it ought to do. When it was pushed on society, you also didn't have a lot of people sitting there pointedly trying to landscape their brain. So you have a lot of neuronetworking going on that's rewiring itself just drastically in large quantities, large numbers. Now, at the same time that LSD is being pushed onto people, the Vietnam War is going on, and you have the television being utilized for the first time in history as a means to help the populace access traumas they have never been exposed to prior. So they have inherited emotional neglect. They are learning incredible trauma suffered by other people, and they are besotted with essentially chemical confusion. And I think animalistically doing everything they can to dampen the effects of all of that on their own individual persons. Then you have Kent State, adding more trauma to the US and what they're capable of seeing happening to their own citizens, to their peers, I guess. And then, on top of that, the boomers were the first generation to have ADHD meds tested on them. So, methamphetamine-based medicine, which is a load of stimulants there. And what stimulants do is, like, if you don't produce enough of something, specifically, I think, dopamine, it will tell your system to provide that. Start providing it until your system does it naturally, or you'll just be dependent on that. But the premise is that you start off not producing enough. Now, if you push stimulants on people that don't need it because you barely understand what ADHD or ADD is in the first place, you create addicts. And then testing the dosage as well. There's this phenomenon, you see Gen Z pointing it out a lot with their need to follow fashion trends to the extent they do. This generation looks older than the prior generation. I've noticed since the 1960s, one generation looks older, the next generation after them looks younger, and it's a pattern. Then the next generation after that looks older, and it is like it skips a generation looking older each time or looking younger. And I think this can also likewise be traced to chemicals, inherited chemicals. Overdosing stimulants can stunt growth, affecting in long-term results the appearance of youthfulness. So, after all of this, you have, Gen X, born to boomers, who were born to emotionally neglectful parents. You have boomers being traumatized, doing everything they can to dampen chemically what their animalistically understanding of their inherited chemicals and the traumas of the nation, raising Gen X. And Gen X was the last generation to see the economic boon born from the efforts of the 70s and the continued efforts of the 80s. And then they were raised by parents who understood the pattern of neglect from their parents. So that's where you get, we were the latchkey kids. We were locked out until the lights came on. And like, I still think if that's the worst thing that happened to you, that's fucking awesome. Great, you know? But you have them learning that being emotionally unattainable, unavailable, is what boomers project as being good enough, due to that being what the Silent Gen said was good enough. And then they, likewise, also have to prove themselves because the boomers had to prove themselves. But they're seeing the highest peak of the economic value in the US that the US has ever really seen. So they're not good enough, but they're able to live well enough. So they have to constantly make amends to everybody around them that they deserve it, which pushes them into the ideology of, I didn't have it good enough, and I deserve this because I struggled, even if they really didn't. So they don't know how to uphold that. You have millennials being born because boomers were taught that you keep having children from their parents' Silent Gen, because part of war efforts was we need a bigger populace to make up for the loss of economic value. We need more people to circulate money, so go have babies. So boomers were also taught having a family, having a large family, helps you feel fulfilled. So they're having children, generations Gen X to millennials, running the gambit of those, I think, 20 years. So millennials are learning from boomers and Gen X. You have some Gen X giving birth to millennials, but that would still be teaching the same ideology of emotional neglect, and being burdened earns you what is deserved. So then Gen Z is born to either older millennials or Gen X. And some Gen X learned from all of that, were far enough away from all the chemical abuse that they were able to snap back and try to take control of it and say, well, because in the 90s, with the uptick of therapy, it became pretty popular to say, I'm not going to do what prior generations have done. I'm going to rewrite history and do it all new. So you had a Gen X saying, I'm not going to raise you like my parents raised me. So Gen Z has a tendency to utilize more deductive reasoning than we've seen in history. Having gone through all of that, I think that is where the fashion trend of struggle earns you what you quote-unquote deserve. Earns you having something nice. Because you had it so bad, no one should be able to take away the good from you. And I think, it did blur itself with specific types of poverty and drug culture as well. And drugs just being heavily prominent in the U.S. Throughout its history. I don't think enough people, understand that the U.S. exists economically on the dependence of illegalities as well as legalities, because those who perform the illegalities are hyper protective of what it is they're doing, so as to be able to continue doing it, whether or not it's understood that the supply came from, or the reason you're able to continue doing it is because you're allowed to. It isn't that it isn't known you're doing it. And with that, I think it is a devised plan. If you take the bottom rung out, it's replaced with the next rung. So if you make people believe that being poor earns you the ability to not be fucked with, you can continue to kill the poor and you won't know that they died because everybody's acting the same. You can continue to increase, decrease, or mess around with the type of chemicals being pushed into society, and no one will know any different because everybody's been addicted. They're all looking to have the reputation that clears them of not having enough experience. So they won't know how many people are being tested on or being killed outright. That is why that culture exists.